Okay, our next speaker comes to us based on his bio from the Twin Cities. Is that correct, Brett? Yes, it's Brett Emmons. He's a senior water resources engineer and CEO of Emmons Olivier Resources Incorporated. Brett's a founding principal manager of this company. He has 29 years of experience in civil and water resources engineering, specializing in natural resource management, preservation, and planning with an emphasis on low-impact design and sustainable development. As I reflect back on the previous talk that Andrew gave, there was some considerations or some senses of concern relative to water and its from urban areas and its impact relative to water resources. Brett's going to address this, and Brett's also led several large-scale development projects throughout the metropolitan Twin Cities and serves as the senior project manager, principal in charge for Emmons Olivier Resources Incorporated watershed management plans. Brett, it's all yours.
Thank you very much for letting me speak today. As you said, I'm from Minnesota. We're a multidisciplinary group of professionals in Minnesota, but work throughout the Midwest and Canada. We work including here in Iowa. And I'm going to talk to you today about something that when we first got involved in this, we were told was impossible, couldn't be done. And we'll walk through that story a little bit about zero discharge. Is it for real? So first of all, I just want to start out with kind of the context here and the primer. Stormwater management really and runoff management is evolving quite a bit. If you think back 20, 30 years, the philosophy was much more on a matter of getting the water away, move it on downstream, get it off your site, let somebody else deal with it. That gave way after the Clean Water Act, after we cleaned up the wastewater treatment plants and industrial discharge and found that our waterways were still impaired. There were still a lot of problems. The fish were not safe to eat, not swimmable. We started coming in with these approaches of temporary storage, building ponds everywhere after the 70s. After a while, though, we started realizing that still wasn't getting us far enough. It was kind of an early triage approach. It provides some benefit. It settles out some of the sediment and the pollutants that are attached to that sediment. But it really wasn't going far enough to get the improvement that we wanted. So kind of the new modern era is much more based on principles of trying to keep the water closer to the source with infiltration, filtration, all sorts of methods like that. There are other methods as well. So we've kind of gone from this early stage of conveyance and this short-term ponding to looking at stormwater very differently in the last 10 to 15 years, really. It's been something that's been kind of sweeping the country from the coast, and I know in our area it's become a very big hot topic for runoff management. I think part of that was reflected in about 2009, National Academy of Sciences had a report that kind of got some leading experts in the country together and said, you know, we've always been so concerned about the pollutants in the runoff, and but really the underlying crux that's kind of bundled up with all those concerns with the pollutants really has to do a lot with the overall volume. As we alter the landscape, we're creating a lot more runoff, a lot more pollutants, but also a lot more runoff to carry those pollutants. And that becomes very hard to control. So their recommendation coming out of that report was really, rather than focusing primarily on the chemicals, we need to increase our focus on the actual volume of runoff coming off the site. And then by de facto, you will also be addressing the chemical pollutants that extra water is carrying. So a little graph down there in the lower right-hand side is a neighborhood where they came in and retrofitted, put in rain gardens. The green graph was a neighborhood right next door to it that had runoff during a summer. And then after they came in and put the rain gardens in, you can see that there was very little runoff coming off of that neighborhood compared to what comes off of a fairly conventional kind of neighborhood. So I think it's always important to also start with, you know, what is the problem? What is it that we're trying to talk about? So just a little bit of Hydrology 101 here. In a natural landscape, these are kind of generalized numbers. Typically, you might see something like 10% of the water comes as runoff or yields out of the system. 40% typically might be taken up by plants, evaporated, and then almost a half of the volume would percolate down into aquifers and replenish our aquifers. Well, when you change the land use, that changes quite a bit. In an urbanization kind of setting, you can have a five-fold increase in that amount of yield and runoff that comes out of the landscape. So that's a very large increase in the volume, creating a lot of hardscape. You're impacting the soils. There's not really the processes there that would hold that water are not there anymore, so the water typically is being shunted off downstream. There's still some vegetation in urban landscapes. You might have 30% still that is taken up by plants. And then a very small amount actually ends up percolating back into the groundwater. And as we're seeing in our area where there's a lot of groundwater, potable water sources, this is becoming also its own big issue. Aside from all the water quality issues that are happening in surface water bodies, there's also this issue of what's happening with our water supply and those groundwater aquifers. And I would point out that there are similar trends in an agricultural conversion from a natural landscape to an agricultural setting. The numbers are a little bit lower, but they're still fairly significant in terms of how much yield is coming out of the system when you change that to an agricultural landscape. Just to prove that I couldn't resist tweaking my presentation at the last minute, when I was in my hotel room and picked up the paper this morning, this was on the front page of the USA Today, talking about water systems, and around the country some new studies coming out about how a lot of water systems are indeed in peril, and we're not really doing a great job of cleaning those up. We know that they're there, we know they're problems, but we're not getting to them. So I mean, it is an issue everywhere, and I think it's an issue that's just going to keep getting bigger and bigger, both in our awareness of it and in terms of the critical nature of it. It's not something that's going to go away anytime soon. What I'm going to do is I'll walk you through a story, if you will, of the city of Inver Grove Heights, and they had a very large area that they saw urban expansion coming to, and they had some real infrastructure challenges. And so they spent over 10 years trying to figure out how they were going to manage all the infrastructure challenges that they had with this. And it turns out that it started to come, stormwater really came to the top as far as one of the key issues that they were wrestling with, trying to understand how they were going to see development evolve. So just a little bit of background, the city of Inver Grove Heights is in the metropolitan area, the Twin Cities, Minneapolis-St. Paul area, more in the southern metro area. It's, if you see here, I did some mapping just to show the yellow and the pink is urban densities that have grown around the area. And I guess the key thing you'll see here is this green is sort of the undeveloped areas. There's a big wildlife refuge down here, but otherwise you can see development has really just developed around this area. And the takeaway from that is, it's in a prime location, as with all real estate, location, location, location. There was a pretty intense pressure to see this area develop because it was in the urban corridors, it's very close to interstates, actually a very nice landscape, and there was a lot of pressure to see this area develop, close to a lot of facilities in the metro area. The area that they were looking at, much of the area is still not developed. A small portion is on this side, but they were looking at about a quarter of their city, almost 3,000 acres, that was they were targeting for urban expansion to occur over the next 20 to 30 years. But what they also started finding as they went in and did their initial studies before we were involved, there are some infrastructure challenges. Just the lay of the land made it very challenging in terms of how they were going to be able to bring services out to this area, sewer and water and stormwater facilities. And the stormwater part of this, the way this project started out was this whole area is actually currently landlocked. There are closed depressions. There is no stream or normal outlet that would carry this water away. The original early engineering plans was kind of a very traditional approach of the water would come down to one of the last basins through a whole system of pumps and pipes, and then they were going to have to do something with that extra urban runoff. That's kind of the typical engineering way of dealing with it. You can try to treat it along the way, but there's always conventional wisdom is, well, you have to get rid of it and send it off somewhere when those big storms come along. Early on there was talk about there's a chain of lakes to the south of the area. I guess we kind of talked about, the previous speaker had several interesting points about, sense of place. That would be kind of one, if this water ever built up high enough, they could pump it over, they could spill over, they would actually pump it over to this chain of lakes. Well, the Marquette chain of lakes is actually a fairly high quality chain of lakes. They're all groundwater fed. They don't really have a great outlet system. You would then have to work on the outlet from there. So several years ago, many years ago, the city council made a policy decision and said, even though we're slating this area for urban development, we're not going to do it at the expense of wiping out these lakes. There was a lot of local concern that we need to be able to develop in a smart way where we're also not giving away and damaging the resources that we care about, like in this case, the chain of lakes that were downstream. So the next proposal in the process was, well, then I guess we'll have to put a large pump and a very long, several mile long pipe and discharge this to the Mississippi River. Well, that is an engineering, it's feasible from an engineering point of view. You can always build something to make it work, but there were some questions and concerns that came along with that. And really the concerns can be highlighted, I think, in these 3 points. And this is a very interesting process, just how this happened in terms of kind of the psychology and the human aspect of this. First of all, the initial engineering studies that sized all those pumps and pipes and looked at what the area charge would have to be for all the land that was going to develop, really started catching everybody by surprise. The developers were concerned. They were saying, well, this seems really high, these charges, we see this as kind of an obstacle to development, and you have these high stormwater development charges because of the place where we're developing. There was this issue of the quality lakes downstream. We don't want to impact those. That took away one of the avenues. So the next one was, well, we'll just create a new discharge to the Mississippi River. And I think 15 years ago, that probably would have gone through sort of from a regulatory point of view without really anybody taking much notice, but that's no longer the case. We've seen this in other cases where new discharges are being proposed to the Mississippi River, and that's no longer a given that you can just do that and run it through the permitting process. There's currently, if you're familiar with the water quality world in the federal level, there's total maximum daily lows, TMDL studies that are out there. And Lake Pavement, which is a wide area of the Mississippi River, because of some old lawsuits with the state of Wisconsin, downstream communities that receive the Mississippi River, there are standards now in place that we're trying to reduce the amount of pollutants in the Mississippi River as it goes down through Lake Pavement and further downstream. So this idea, from a regulatory point of view, to say that zero was the precondition and you're going to propose an outlet, it's kind of a hard way to nuance your way out of that argument, that you're still stuck on the hook of saying, well, this looks like we're heading in the wrong direction from what our standards are telling us and our permitting is telling us. And I think another underlying part of this, which was interesting, was a lot of the landowners out in the area, really felt like they were a little bit disappointed also in seeing development happen around them in the other communities, and what they kind of considered sort of a typical or generic sprawl. A lot of the natural features and landscape features out there on the land end up just being kind of wiped away. It's sort of a clean slate, come in, grade the site, throw up the houses, and this actually is very rolling, lots of woods mixed in on the hillsides in this landscape. It was a very nice landscape, and they wanted to take a look at that and see what could happen. So there was actually a landowner group. It's interesting how this started. The landowner group said, we're not saying no to development, but we're saying let's see if we can do it in a smart way. And so their main goals coming into this and talking to the city and eventually engaging the city and getting the city on board was, we want to see if there's other options out here. Can we reduce costs? These costs seem to be quite high. They're asking themselves and started asking others, well, what about the natural system? So far, the water takes care of itself fairly well, but now we're talking about building all this extra infrastructure. What about the natural systems and how those work? And then another piece of it was, is there some way we can keep some of that character of the landscape that's being built there so we don't lose all of that through this urbanization process? And really what that led to at the time when this group got together and started looking around over 10 years ago now, low impact development was just coming on the scene. And it was just this idea of keeping water at the source, preserving the water and not just always kind of shunting it downstream, and a whole new suite of techniques being used to accomplish that. Green infrastructure is probably the new buzz term that a lot of people use federally for this idea of new approaches to water management. So they got very interested in this and started asking around, making a lot of calls, getting the city engaged, having the city council people come out and look at the area and walk the land with them and talk them through it. And they did start saying, well, it looks like there's this other alternative out there. We'd like to see whether this could give us some of the things that we want out of this, and it doesn't seem like we should study it. At least see, rule it out if it's not feasible, but at least take a look at it before we just embark on this very expensive, difficult journey. So that's where we got involved, is we were asked to come in. We were known for looking at these new approaches, new ideas, and they asked us to come in and say, well, what would a system look like? Can you model this and forecast what this would look like underneath this new paradigm, this new approach of low impact development? And what might the cost be, and how can we show that we can protect the urban development that comes in here? what kind of system would this look like? And just a quick idea here in terms of what we talked about in terms of low impact development or green infrastructure tools. Part of it is also just land planning. What is the development pattern? How can you maybe preserve some of the natural areas, some of the key areas that work in the landscape? And then there's a whole host of what we call best management practices, BMPs, that are available now that weren't quite the old pond approach, but for things like rain gardens, infiltration trenches, green roofs, harvesting and irrigation of water, which basically keeps the water much more at the source where it falls and tries to use those natural processes versus just kind of moving it on downstream for someone else to deal with. Another way to look at how the low impact development approach works is you're really thinking of it, sometimes referred to as a treatment train, or it's I kind of like to think of it as sort of a multi-stage process where you can be taking care of the water along the way. So at the very source, you can be picking up water and not necessarily shunting it off of your site. You can come up with, you can take a look at the routing, during the routing process. Maybe instead of in the concrete pipe, you route it in a way that you can filter and retain water. Then you can create some sort of practice, whether it be surface or subsurface, before it gets down to a basin at the end for treatment. There's a lot of places along that path that you can extract the water and keep it. And then even when it gets down to the basin, maybe you can reuse it somehow. These are all kind of the new approaches to stormwater management. So we basically embarked on a several-year process of analyzing this system for the city, which included a lot of modeling studies. We did several modeling. We started at a small scale, kind of proved that it could work, but we kept expanding it to larger scales until we were covering the whole 3,000 acres and showed that, from a water budget and modeling design point of view, there was a way to preserve the water in the system. Part of that was using these low impact development techniques. Those were bundled in this whole assumption. We did actually had the city was insightful enough to have us do some monitoring. So we had a year and a half's worth of rainfall runoff monitoring, so we could actually validate and calibrate our models. So we had a very high confidence in our modeling data and what we were predicting. We even had a very large storm that came through, about a 100-year event for our area during our monitoring area, so we felt like we had a good range of what was happening. We also then dove into some of the planning standards, city standards, and some of those are actually designed in a way that are counterproductive to low impact development. Wide streets, curb and gutter, things like that. So we really came in there and looked at how do we better adapt those to low impact design approaches and take out some of those barriers. We developed an entire low impact development stormwater manual for the city. We knew this was going to be new for developers and for city staff, so they needed a technical resource where they could turn to get that kind of information. I guess the other thing we found through this whole process and asking around, and I think credit goes to the city, this was the first, this scale, and this idea that we could actually manage all the water and not create a new outlet using a low impact approach. We could not find anything in the country. We were asking all the national experts, and there was nothing out there of its kind that had been done at this kind of scale. There were little things dabbled here and there, but it was never kind of the ultimate solution. It was always just kind of a piece combined with a conventional kind of outlet approach. So, and having asked around again recently, I think we're still in about that position. This is probably one of the first precedent-setting cases here in the country to take this approach of using low-impact development to a very high level and not necessarily relying on a conventional kind of outlet. So we'll talk a little bit more about how we got there and what are the pieces that get us there in this kind of groundbreaking approach. So to highlight some of the technical standards that we developed as part of this, we felt were necessary to be able to put in place this kind of system. The first thing we did is, from our monitoring data, we were realizing that a lot of these landscapes, it depended on the soils and the cover, but many of the landscapes were not really creating much runoff up through a 5-year event, which is a fairly large event, so something on the order of 3.5 inch event. Most of the water would stay at the site scale before runoff would be generated. So we decided that was going to become our benchmark to say, okay, every time a development comes in, they have to meet our low impact design standards, and what that means is they have to analyze, and the important thing we did as well is they have to analyze the precondition, and then they have to show that when they build their development out and add all their practices, they can meet that pre-amount of runoff. So it's not the same as saying no runoff comes off your site. It's just saying what are your soils, what are your land cover, and whatever naturally comes off of the site, that's what you're still allowed to discharge, but you have to retain the rest of that. So we had a pre-post 5-year volume control. We were able to support that with our monitoring data. A lot of these practices end up being infiltration practices. A lot of the volume control approaches are. And so one of the early failures of infiltration basins and infiltration practices was things that were fairly predictable and could have been prevented. And things, so what we found was, pretreatment is oftentimes overlooked, especially during the construction process, but it's just in general. So when you have a low impact being designed LID BMP, you need to protect that, or you're going to be constantly in there trying to fix it and maintain it. You need to have a lot of that sediment carried with the runoff settled out in a pretreatment area before it then goes into the actual volume control feature. So we have a pretty rigorous pretreatment standards that have to be met. Another big piece of this is obviously when we were studying this, we noticed there's a lot of very large natural depressions that, since the glaciers left, tens of thousands of years ago, that water has been coming in and seeping into these areas. And so when those big events came, there was still storage and plenty of storage in the system to be able to retain that water. So we basically came in and made sure we mapped all of these and made that also a condition of development, that these flood-prone areas that do occasionally see water, these are areas that we feel have been proven. We don't want to try to fill them here and replace them someplace else. They already have a proven track record. Let's just stay out of it. And finally, we did have to look at what's our contingency plan. I mean, obviously this feels like it carries some risk with it. What are we going to do in terms of extreme floods or things that even go beyond what we're projecting? We were projecting fairly conservative scenarios, but we needed to have a sort of an approach. And so we kind of came up with an interesting three-tiered approach to managing that risk that I haven't seen in many places. So I'll go through each one of these a little bit to explain what we're talking about here. Here's again on that matching the 5-year volume control. This is another set of slides that talk through kind of this strategies of retaining the water before it just runs off. Part of it is looking at pollution prevention. What do you do kind of at the site to not generate as much runoff or much pollution or sediment going downstream? Next, what can you do very close to the place where the water falls to be able to retain the water there, whether it's stormwater landscaping, disconnecting impervious areas, reducing impervious cover. There's all sorts of strategies that can keep the water very close to the source. Then there are also a lot of small-scale source controls, things like rain gardens, grass waterways, best management practices. And then finally, at the end, after you peel off all that water, if you still need some sort of a structural centralized feature, you can have that. It's typically a lot smaller at that point if you need it. And then finally, you would discharge whatever your water body is downstream. So all of this needs to happen at the development scale before it goes into these regional basins. So we actually came in, the next part of this was a pretreatment standard. We had a fairly rigorous pretreatment standard where we made sure that before water discharges one of these volume controls, it has to go through some sort of a pretreatment. The interesting thing is a few of these filter strips where water just sheet flows across the flush curve and just filters down through the grass is actually extremely effective. And it doesn't necessarily imply a lot of cost or a lot of land usage to be able to get that, benefit of the filtration. Vegetated swales, if water runs down, it can also run through a vegetated area. There's a lot of filtering, a lot of uptake of water and sediment that happens. If you have a rain garden or sort of concentrated, you can have there's all sorts of varieties of these now, of different kinds of little sumps that right at the inlet of a small scale practice, you can do that. Retain that sediment there, and you can easily access that for maintenance. And then probably the least favorite, but the one we said was still allowable, was to create some sort of a pre-settling pond. Standard would be something called a dirt pond or a wet pond. It would actually be your pre-treatment before it went to the final treatment area. That would also be one way to remove sediment. I would note that this takes more land when you do that versus these other approaches, and oftentimes can be more expensive. On that part, the third part about natural depressions and what we started calling the regional basins that were very important that we knew in the system. Basically, we mapped those throughout the city, mapped their starting water levels, their high water levels, to all sorts of back-to-back, 100-year events, fairly high events, and said these are the regional basins that, as development comes in, you need to be able to work around that. There's some interesting land use pieces that we built in that made that also a lot more amenable to the development community. Over the years, having introduced new things like wetland management planning and these kind of things, oftentimes developers can deal with a new approach, or they can deal with some of these standards, but they want to know going in what the ground rules are. I mean, I think this is critical to be able to let people know coming in, these are the areas that we expect you to set aside. We can always fine tune them with better data, but this is generally where they are. So when they're going to go and acquire a piece of property, they know what they have to work with and what is off the table. And that's something that they feel is very workable. They, at least now they come in and they're not going to get surprised later with, oh, I thought I bought 40 acres, but it turns out I only have 30 acres that I can develop because of this surprise. As long as they know that going in, I've seen that over and over again with development community, this is a workable way for them to move forward with the project and really know what they're getting into. And finally, on this contingency overflows and kind of what is our backup plan, our contingency plan, what we ended up coming up with is, because of the character of these natural basins that are scattered throughout the community, some were shallower, certainly would overflow in a very large event down to the next basin, like this. Some were kind of a mid-level that would take quite a bit of water to fill them up, but if you got to within maybe 6 feet of the overflow, 6 to 10, 18 feet from the overflow, then the water would spill out. And then we found some basins that were as much as 60 feet deep that would have to build up that much before it would ever get to the overflow. It seems kind of unimaginable that we're going to use all that 60 feet. And obviously, as your basin is getting higher, it's also getting much larger and it has a lot more volume. So we ended up coming with a 3-tiered standard that if you're building around one of these kind of shallower basins, you will use kind of a conventional, what we call freeboard, or a safety factor that you put on top of where buildings need to be built above the high water level plus this freeboard to give them a safety factor. You would use a very conventional kind of 2 feet above the 100-year high water level calculated, or the 1 foot above the overflow, whichever is greater. But in this next set of basins, the category of basins, we had sort of an intermediate step where we put in this idea that we're going to actually have a higher freeboard, give ourselves much more of a safety valve, if you will, inside the system of 6 feet instead of just the 2 feet. And then we will provide a perched overflow because of those depths. It was not that costly to build an overflow to the next basin. So we would have a backup plan if we needed it, or could even access this if we needed it at some point. So the home would still be below some sort of overflow, but the high water levels, even in our extreme conditions, are below that overflow, so we're not kind of creating this domino effect of always pushing water downstream to the next basin and causing a problem there. We're keeping the water in these small compartmentalized segmented areas. And finally, in these handful of 6 or 8 different basins that are extremely deep, we felt you could put in a gravity overflow down deep. That's fairly expensive. And we looked at some of these basins, and they tend to be fairly sort of well-developed basins. We actually set a 10-foot freeboard. So again, a pretty large safety factor, and obviously the basin's getting bigger as it goes up, so there's a lot of volume there. And then we provide an easement corridor in the system, as well as having an inlet pipe being built at the time the development happens, so that they could bring out a temporary pump or add a pump later in the event they needed it in 20, 50, 100 years or never. They would be in a position they could still come in here and deal with this kind of situation, but still have a very high safety factor. So I want to highlight a few of the, I guess I would call the policy elements of this. We talked some more about the technical. Here are some, I think, kind of fairly unique things that we came upon with this whole process, with working with the planners on how to do this. And I think that was another very interesting part of this whole project, was that it did have a nice interplay between the land use planning and the zoning and the engineering and design side. We found some co-benefits, some convergence of where we saw advantages on both sides of working together. So one of the unique things we did is we said, we are going to require, and partially to preserve the natural landscape we talked about earlier as one of the goals, we're going to preserve 20% of the open space on the site. And to clarify, that was not, we didn't let developers or someone come in and say, well, I've got an island median that's 8 feet wide and 12 feet long. That doesn't count as far as green space, nor backyards. I mean, this is true dedicated green space that is outside of a private property, that is continuous, it has to have a certain width, and it has to be continuous within the site. So it really is preserving more of that natural landscape feature. So that's a big deal. I mean, that's taking away people's land. These regional basins can be part of this 20% open space. The BMPs can be included in the open space, and then also we're looking for this to be part of a trail network and a kind of a community connector facility that helps keep that landscape there. I'll talk a little bit about the other part of this that works well, is the zoning flexibility. And I have a slide here where I'll walk you through this. Basically what we were trying to accomplish here was sort of a land use approach of clustering was becoming more popular at the time. Maybe we allow greater density, but try to have some areas that be set aside. So that way you can still get the units out of it, but you are giving a little more flexibility on the site. So we came up with some zoning flexibility that said, basically you're able to calculate what the underlying zoning, you're able to calculate whatever number of units you would normally get. You now set aside 20%, with the 80% you have left, you can put those units on that 80%, which includes needing to have some density flexibility. But basically then at that point, the development community can get the same number of units out of it that they would have gotten before, as well as creating some of the amenity units. Parking lot standard is one I just decided to highlight. That's one that we went around and around, and we all kind of agreed that the trend towards these large commercial centers and office centers that have these very, very large parking lots that never seem to be full, just seems like, you know, we're putting a lot of expense in that, we're creating a lot of runoff, heat island effects, there's all these downsides, including the monetary side, and maybe we should go back and relook at those parking lot standards. So I'll touch on what we did there. Some simple things that we were seeing happen a lot with the local site development approach. Look at narrower streets. So we've worked with the city engineering department to come up with a one-side parking narrower street, whereas they were normally going to 32, 34 foot suburban low volume streets. We actually tightened that back up into narrower streets. And some developments can do a private street and even go narrower than this. The city allows that as well. And finally, I'll touch on a little bit of the cost analysis and where we landed in terms of the cost of coming up with a whole different approach to stormwater management. So going back to that 20% open space and zoning standards, basically what we wanted to show was, or what we needed to create was this idea that in a very normal suburban urban landscape, certain blocks of land would be set aside. This is single family residential. This over here next door is multifamily townhome density. This next spot is apartment densities, but they're all very segregated. And there's a lot of kind of new urbanism planning approaches to this that say it's not so bad to have that mixing of uses. And so what we did when we said, you know, you have 80% of the site to work with, and we need 20% of open space and stormwater, was instead of saying that, you know, all of your site has to be kept within this one kind of size of lot, we actually created this whole table that allowed a lot of blending or blurring of those lines. So if they were in an R1C, which traditionally the community had been a single family, you know, 3 or 4 units per acre, they can do all the land that they want to develop, they can do in that density, but they could also go up to the next density and do that kind of density to get their full number of units. They now have more flexibility of how they do that. And so as you step down through the different densities, there's always the ability to come in and use different densities and mix them on a site. So that met some urban planner kind of goals, and met our goals of being able to have this 20% open space available that we needed. So it gave that extra increased flexibility across the districts. Which again, I don't know, it's somewhat novel in that this was kind of a stormwater planning integration of that I haven't seen very often. Next, I'll talk a little bit about the parking lot standards. This one I think has been fairly successful. There are many different pieces of this, but these I just tried to pick some of the highlights. What we found in the community was we started asking the question of staff, and they were tending to agree that it seems like the parking lots that are typically, everyone's just borrowing from everybody else's standard, and I think everyone has this idea that, kind of like the McDonald's trend for a while, bigger is better, that more the merrier. But we started to kind of, maybe we should start putting some of these things on a diet. Maybe not bigger is better is always the solution. So in the old standards in the city, there were certain parking counts by the size of the building that was being built. And you had to at least create this much parking for that amount of space that you were built by city code. And you could go up to really kind of limitless. If you wanted to build a parking lot twice that big, I guess that's your prerogative. So we really kind of turned that around and we said, no, we want to start talking about putting caps. It's not that you can't go above the cap, but here's our expectation. What we said is that old minimum is now going to be expressed as 75% of that old minimum is now the maximum that you can use a conventional parking service on. If you want to go up to the old minimum, and we've had some projects that have done that, you can still do that. But what you're going to do when you do that is you're going to build the rest of that parking space in a permeable surface. And we even kind of, the planners had come up with this idea, made it a little more punitive. If you were to propose a parking field that was larger than the old minimum, you actually have to do at least half of it in permeable and or a structured stacked parking. And so it's been really nice to see this play out on several of the developments that have been built in Grove Heights. This target in the background I'll show you in a minute. They had proposed doing something bigger. They know Target understands themselves as a store that they probably are going bigger than they need to. So they actually quickly talked themselves down to, not triggering this. So they came back to this size, and so then we said, well, this is what you're going to have to do. So they did end up putting 25% of the parking into permeable stalls, like permeable asphalt. And I'll show you some of that here in a minute. And then there's another site that was a business park. And they came in and saw the standard. And they were like, yeah, that's fine, we can go with this size, but we're not really sure if we really need all those stalls. Yeah, that's probably true. You might want to see if you really need them before you build them. And they said, well, this permeable stuff seems kind of expensive to build. It can be somewhat expensive to build. So they actually just built out the permeable, the regular asphalt part, and then they put a green space area there that they could add on to with the permeable if they ever needed it. But they took the approach, big surprise, let's wait and see whether we really need it, rather than building these very large fields that seem like parking fields that don't very often get utilized completely. So that was another, I think, win where the developers spent less money and we got a better outcome. And they were kind of very comfortable with the idea that, yeah, they probably are high, we probably don't need this, we can just plant it with grass right now, and later if we need to add on, we'll add on later and incur that cost. Let's wait and actually see whether we need it first. And this, again, was something that the city had to get their arms around this too. A lot of times the city is also requiring this development, so there's both the development community and the cities that need to be able to be willing to kind of look at this differently. So just to kind of compare and contrast, and I'll look at some costs here in a minute, of what I would call the old approach, a very kind of typical traditional approach that had been looked at about 15 years ago here. That old plan that had all been kind of mapped out and costed out was a bunch of pumps and pipes. There was almost 13 pump stations to move the water through these series of depressions to kind of connect the dots. There was 24 miles of storm sewer piping that would have been done, trunk storm sewer, to make all this work. And there would have been this new outlet of almost 4 miles out to the Mississippi River, which also had all that cost implied to do that. In this enhanced LID, low impact design approach, this plan used a lot more low impact design, green element, green infrastructure tools that needed to be done on the development scale. Interesting thing is we get all sorts of better outcomes with this. There's really, when you use these kind of green design tools, you can outperform head and shoulders above any conventional design. It's just almost impossible to compare them side by side. You're going to get much better water quality outcomes. You're going to get that volume control. I started out at the very beginning saying that's really a key driver in a lot of these problems. You're actually reducing the volume. The conventional approach would not have done anything with the volume. You're creating some more open space often when you do this. This is becoming a national trend where some of the advantages of these new approaches is actually just the green landscape that they created in an urban setting. And the fact that it happens to do some stormwater stuff is something that people like, fine, maybe you don't realize that that's happening. But it's like that, the fact that when we walk down the street, we have some greenery, some shade. It also replenishes the groundwater, which in our area is becoming a very, very big deal, of not just shunting all this water downstream to the river. And finally, and I'll go through a little bit on the cost, it ended up being the upfront capital cost to build this low-impact design approach over the original plan was 75% less. So that's a pretty big eye-opener for the community. And obviously there were some skeptics at the city, and they were nervous about being the first ones. But with the cost savings like that, they felt like this is something we were going to pursue. We're going to make the investment to try to see if we can make this work. So what we did is we ended up running a kind of a whole life cycle cost on this. The original cost for the traditional approach had upfront infrastructure costs that have to be done. You have to develop a user fee that comes in to pay that infrastructure cost. You'd have to have O&M over the life cycle of all of this. That was a big concern. Well, we're going to build these green techniques, but maybe the operation and maintenance is just going to eat us up at cost. So we looked at a 30-year life cycle cost. Interestingly, what we were finding is going around to some of the communities that had built those wet ponds over the years, and they've been around now for 15, 20 years. In a way, they could kind of fool themselves and feel like, well, there's zero maintenance costs. Well, until the pond fills up with the sediment, and then it actually is quite costly to go out and dredge that pond. We were starting to find contaminants in some of the ponds that even needed some special handling. Aside from the special handling, there's a lot of cost just in doing that. It's just something that gets delayed for every 15 years or so, but it is a cost that you have to account for. Even at the operation and maintenance costs, they're very similar. So overall, if you take a life cycle cost of both the upfront savings and the O&M, you end up with something that's less than half the cost of that conventional system. Instead of something like a $54 million investment with almost $30 million in upfront cost, you can cut that by more than half. People like graphs who take a look at it. Here's just sort of a graphical representation of what that infrastructure cost and the O&M cost look like in comparison. So pretty compelling argument. So in 2007, we had been writing all these ordinances. All the ordinances were in place. The stormwater manual had been written. Education sessions were out there, and the city embarked on full-scale starting their build-out of this 3,000 acres. And it acknowledged that really the stormwater piece of this was one of the main constraints that they had to work through to get this off the ground. So next I'll show you some of the first projects to get built. There's obviously a hiatus there for a little while when the recession came, but this has been one of the first areas to pick back up with development, and they now have quite a bit of development going on and have for the last 4 or 5 years. So really, from the city and landowner perspective, we can reduce costs for the development, the infrastructure part. And something I wanted to maybe point out here too is with that recession coming along, a lot of the old system would have had to have that pipe to the Mississippi River built first, because as soon as you start creating runoff in these dead-end systems, you don't want people to flood, you need to be able to get the water out. That's kind of the way that system is designed. So what you find is you end up investing right up front. As soon as you start development, you have to have maybe almost half or more of your initial cost has to be in place already to create that first backbone so we can start receiving the water. In the system that we designed, it's actually very segmented. So you can come in and develop in a certain area, you take care of your water in that area, and then you're done. So it's a very low cost. Now, something we really didn't think about going into this, but the recession kind of brought to light for us, was that we actually saved a lot of capital costs because we weren't having, when those first developments were starting to be built, we didn't have to have this huge expenditure right up front. It can be very staged and brought in just as needed. That saves a lot of interest costs, and it's a lot better financially for the community. We're able to retain the character of the landscape that we're trying to accomplish here, and come up with sort of these natural functions. What are the natural systems, and how do we use those to our advantage, which led us to this low-impact development approach, which will illustrate this development that we have here. It had several different multiple land uses. So I guess what we found coming into this, and what's compelling about it, I touched on this a little bit already, is you're really seeing a whole multitude of benefits that kind of keep stacking up with this approach. You're having improved water quality. There's better water quality out of this development than there would have been underneath that conventional ponding approach. Actually, with the freeboard, the way we've done it, there's a community right next door that has built out in that pump and pipe system, and they had a lot of faith in that. Well, they've had some large events come through that have actually flooded several neighborhoods and had some major retrofit projects that they're not trying to go back in and fix. So this actually has a much more contingency and much more resiliency set into it, even for large events. Reduces costs, we've already talked quite a bit about. Preserves the landscapes, our 20% open space, the way they're trying to design around that has created some nice landscape features, and the water bodies downstream of this are not receiving all the polluted runoff from these areas that might have been partially treated. We're replenishing the aquifer, which is a big deal. We're not just running this water off downstream. The other one I touched on, we're seeing more and more of these new projects, is if the designer, which is a challenge, if the designer can think and plan early on to really integrate this into their site planning, we'll see some examples here. You can actually use less land for stormwater facilities with this new creative approach than you would with a very conventional approach where you have to have these big ponds that eat up chunks of the site. And the other part of it is just that we want to, the idea that you can actually create quality landscapes in these developments. The lead developer on this project, where we were brought in the design team, because it was the first one in the community, Argenta Hills, one of his, probably one of my things I'll remember in my career for a long time. He had been there all along through the planning. When we actually built this and Target was moving into their store and everyone was moving in out here, it was like, I knew it was coming, but this actually looks so incredibly nice. I didn't even expect it to look as nice as it ended up looking. So it really was creating quality landscapes with this too. So I mean, I think this is one Argenta feels is this development. It started out as, maybe we'll go back to the last slide. Not on there, there's a map. The southern part of the site is all a commercial center. There's a new county road that goes through here to connect some other pieces of the county road. And on the northern part of the site is all residential with a lot of rolling hills. So this is the kind of downtown Main Street area. They wanted it to have kind of a very nice feel as you come into this commercial center. The Target off to the back. And so this is one that I talked about. I think a lot of people come in here maybe don't see the stormwater. And where's the big stormwater pond here? Well, it turns out stormwater is integrated throughout this. There's at least 7 different stormwater practices that are depicted here, and I'll show you some photos after this has been built. All the median, originally the medians were going to be, the landscape architect had designed them to be mounted. We said, no, we want to use these medians and be able to take the water and let that soak back into the ground. So we did. We depressed all the medians. So there's stormwater going into all these medians. Rain gardens, if you will. Um, Next, the intersections, we end up using permeable pavers for those. It kind of creates a nice look. It provides a lot of volume that we can retain on the site, so it's not taking up any of the site, taking it away from use. It's just using it in a different way with these permeable pavers to infiltrate the water. Next to some of these commercial buildings on Main Street, several of them have little rain gardens right at the edge of that takes their roof runoff. And since the roof runoff is fairly clean, it doesn't need to be pre-treated like other runoff would need to be. And actually, show up very well. You'll see in some other photos, there's quite a bit of porous asphalt because of the way they wanted to do that parking lot standard. They had a lot of porous asphalt stalls that were included here. So this is, when my kids were growing up, I used to read them Waldo. Where was Waldo? I call my Where's Waldo stormwater management approach to development. So here's the Main Street as it was being built out several years ago. I'll just kind of run through some photos of this kind of commercial development. We really felt like, here's a place where we're going to have very high impervious, very intense development. We're kind of starting out with one of the harder type scenarios where we're going from no water running off of this site downstream to a very highly developed site. This is going to be a good test case to see how this looks. That was one reason why the city said, yeah, we'd like you to be on the design team as this gets done. This is going to be kind of one of our benchmark projects that we're going to start in the community. So here are the median islands being created in. Here's the permeable pavement as it was being installed in the intersections. You can see there's rock courses that allow the water to just drain straight down and make contact with the sandy soil below. Here was right after it was finished being constructed and they were starting to irrigate and get everything going. Here's what it looked like later. This is right after a storm. The water comes in off of the street and the surrounding areas and flows into these depressed islands, and then the water infiltrates. This is after the storm has passed. When it gets up to the spot before it goes over the curve, it can go down to the next island. And I've seen water in this first of the three fairly frequently. I've seen water in the middle of the three occasionally, and I've rarely, even that coming out right after a storm, I've rarely seen much water in that third of the chain at least, and all the water is gone by the time that gets that far. So we really have, this project has been a year and a half ago when we had some fairly major flooding in the South Metro area. We had over 10 inches over a couple days. There was massive, there were roads being washed out. This site did not discharge a drop. It really wasn't even tested very hard. Some regional basins in the area just had a little bit of water in them, and they performed much better than we expected. Here's some more shots of Main Street, and that's the new residential on the other side of the street. That's all been built up over the last several years. Here's, I thought it's kind of interesting just to see, the contractor was very good to work with on this. These are the permeable pavement stalls. So obviously there's conventional pavement out here too. We put them in with asphalt. It is a little bit more susceptible to wear and tear. And you can use permeable concrete for the asphalt pavers. Asphalt is probably the one that has the most care. So what we did is put them in kind of the overflow. The Target store is just off to the left here. So this is kind of the overflow parking area. So it gets the least amount of traffic. And they actually, fortunately, they worked with us very well throughout the construction process to make sure all the infiltration BMPs were well protected so they weren't contaminated with the sediment during the construction process. So they actually came in, did all the regular paving, made sure all the sediment was taken care of, and then we came in and excavated this out and put in the rock for the permeable pavement, so we didn't end up compromising our BMP, our practice right away. So I don't know, a lot of people seen permeable pavements being installed. I think they're fairly common here in Iowa. Raise your hand if you know permeable pavements have seen projects. Half of you have seen that. So here's permeable pavement, permeable asphalt being laid down in one of these parking lot bays. Obviously the water goes in. It's kind of nice, interesting to see this after snow melt. They pile a lot of snow in the corners of the parking lot at Target, and then as the water comes across the regular asphalt and gets to the permeable, it just goes a certain number of feet, and then all that water just goes down into the ground. So here's a couple of the other kind of practices. Target at first was very hesitant. They didn't want to see, they tried some rain gardens right near, wasn't actually in front of the store. And they were kind of wild looking and they didn't really like, they didn't get good maintenance. So we came in with a very, very important, tight kind of planting plan. It was very formal, easy to maintain. So we ended up putting rain gardens right in front of their store, which at first they told us we were never going to do. But we said, well, your other choices are doing something underground, which is quite a bit more expensive. And eventually they came around to, okay, let's do that. Here's more of the permeable parking asphalt. So a whole variety of practices, and I guess One thing I was going to note is, you do need to get water off of the site, either with the flush curb or with frequent curb cuts to let it filter and get down into the BMPs, and that can be a clever way to not take up as much space and cost to try to do it. In the residential, there's quite a bit of open space. Actually, that was more of the rolling part of the site. They actually have more than 20% open space. They're closer to 30%. They have a whole network of trails that runs all the way through these wooded hills. It's a very special, I think it's a very neat neighborhood if you ever get in there. They started requiring all the cul-de-sacs to have rain gardens in the center of them rather than just being more asphalt that we're laying down. So it's serving a purpose, and I think really makes the area look very nice. We had one phase that had such difficult topography that the developer still wanted to go into a centralized pond, but they're running out of space to do both a pre-treatment pond and a regular pond. So they ended up coming in, and we decided to use what we started seeing a lot more of, which is stormwater harvesting and use, where we're catching the water in a pond, but then we're taking it back out and irrigating it onto the landscape. We actually had to develop a model to do this because there wasn't a good sizing tool to make sure we're meeting the standards. So we put together a model that now calculates that, and it's good for the designer to be able to see kind of what happens in different types of years, how much of the storage is used. This is kind of the output of saying if it gets to the overflow, whether it's being drawn down during the year, so that you know whether your storage is keeping up with all the rest of your water that comes in. Because it needs to be like a little mini water line to be able to see if it really works. I'll go through these quickly. There's some slides here. I was invited out to North Carolina. There was a roads conference, so we also wanted to show some kind of in-road type of scenarios where these kind of new techniques have been used. This is a infiltration chamber off in a right-of-way next to a road reconstruction project. So there was a grass area that they didn't want to do a rain garden, so they ended up doing it underground, and all of that water was zero discharge out of this. We were at the city of St. Paul, surprisingly enough. They had some streets that did not have a lot of utilities in them, and they have very good sandy soil, so we ended up putting infiltration trenches actually underneath the roads in certain sections of St. Paul. And many of these areas have had no discharge since we built these almost 10 years ago. This was a large underground chamber system that was built they collected a whole section of neighborhood, where again, they didn't want to do a service feature because they wanted that play area above, green space above. So we did it underground, and this has not had a discharge. It flows to a lake in a park, and it's not had a discharge since it's been monitored over 10 years. In one case, we did sort of an infiltration trench off the sidewalk, again, where there was some sensitivity to having a rain garden. I guess the nice thing about it is there's a lot of sweet tools, a lot of different approaches you can use to do this the way you want. Can I wrap up here? This just gives you an idea of the northwest area of River Pipes. This map, there's probably 3 or 4 new developments that I could add on here that have either been recently permitted or right now coming in. We've had a whole mix of uses. We had the Argenta Hills we were talking about, half commercial, half residential. We had a senior housing project. We had office parks, proposed a lot of single-family residential, townhome kind of developments. So we've seen now every kind of land use type that we could encounter, and feel like that's worked quite well. And I guess one of the other obviously reasons we were very happy and feel like this is a precedent-setting type project is we submitted this through a awards process. The American Council of Engineering Companies, they do a big award every year and take applications from all over the country. We went through the state award, and we're moved on to the national award, and they had 170 some applicants, and 8 of the top projects last year were selected for a award. This was one of the projects that was selected. So I think it really does set a new tone for how stormwater can be done differently, and I think there's a lot of advantages to doing it differently. It's not necessarily a loss. It's not like you do one thing and lose something else. You can actually put it together in a win-win kind of way. So I think this is kind of the trend of the future, the paradigm of the future of trying to look at how you can take this green infrastructure, and I think that's why that term is becoming more popular now, is you can create amenities on your site at the same time you're taking care of stormwater issues that you needed to take care of. So if I summarize again what makes it work, in this case, how does this work, and maybe sort of the take-home messages. First of all, was a big emphasis on keeping water at the site, and part of that was understanding the hydrology. You need to mimic what the natural hydrology is there. Don't try to force something that may not work, but also you need to understand what does work there, what naturally works, and so what you can work with. Integrating the stormwater with the land use, we've got a lot of win-win situations where we were working with the planners and we were both getting benefits. We did look at some of those natural landscape features like those large depressions and the good soils and make sure that we plan that into our design. And then we developed an ordinance and stormwater manual. Operation and maintenance plans are required, and a fee structure to basically make sure this is well-rounded ready to roll out for the world. So if you think back to our original slide, what is the natural condition of your watershed? What is it that it naturally wants to be? That's really, I think, something that oftentimes gets overlooked in a lot of design processes. We always want to jump ahead to well, this is what I know runs off of my proposed land use, whether it's urban or even agricultural. So that's what I'm going to plan for. But we really need to step back and take a little more time to think about what is the natural type of system that you have and work with that. So I think that's the take-home message for me is, try to figure out what's a reasonable target for your site. In our case, it was 0 runoff. Maybe in a different site, it's 15% runoff. But at least come up with that target, understand your site, and then I think you can easily design to accomplish that kind of performance and not just kind of give up and say, okay, we're going to have a 5-fold increase or a 3-fold increase in the runoff. We can get back to something that's much more manageable. Last, I'll just acknowledge the city staff and the council for jumping into this new paradigm, both feet in, and the developers and for that Argenta Hills developers and contractors were actually very good to work with. With that, thank you. Maybe time for a few questions. Question was, going back to development approaches, do they work in all sorts of different places in the country or landlocked areas like this? Good, very good question. They apply everywhere. They're being used a lot on the East Coast, Washington, New York has a pretty aggressive system, Pittsburgh, West Coast, all over the country. And again, just as long as you understand you're trying to mimic your natural setting, that's a good benchmark to start with. So you don't kind of say, well, this place has 0 runoff. I'm going to go to the spot that has clay soil and high water table. I'm expecting that benchmark it properly. There are the same techniques, basically the plants in the soil do a lot more of the work versus sending it downstream. And that's what takes care of it.
I have a question. So you said this is a new development. So how can you prevent the water developments are actually, you already have cities there. How can you take those cities and convert them into this new form of
Yeah, we've worked with a lot of communities that are actually more in that retrofit situation and seen a lot of that happen here in Minneapolis, St. Paul. That's why we kept these road projects in, because these are all road reconstruction or existing neighborhoods where we came back in and again got to 0 discharge, which again seems almost like unfathomable, but basically you tend to go more subsurface. It just depends on the kind of local setting if they like rain gardens or not. But it can be done even in fully built out communities. You can come back in and still reap the benefits of a green infrastructure approach.
So question, who is doing the maintenance?
Who is doing the maintenance? Very good question. There is, in the case of Evergrove Heights, we had to tackle that coming in. The residential areas where a lot of distributed practices, they go that route. The city said they will step forward and be the guarantor that makes sure the maintenance is done. When it's in these commercial settings that the city prefers, they would be the fallback, and they would prefer that the private entity do the maintenance. And the interesting thing in that commercial setting we were in, the commercial developer was in the same boat. They were like, yeah, the city probably isn't going to necessarily have a certain aesthetic they want to keep. They're just going to want to make sure it functions. We have a certain way we want it to look. So we'd actually rather be in charge of maintenance than have the city come in and just kind of do a minimalist type of approach.
So
You have to work that out.
Is there a special training program between city staff or landscape companies?
We have, we started getting more questions whether the landscape companies are training. Started doing a little bit of training. I think that still more of that is needed. Train city staff and a few folks who'd like to get back and kind of do more public training. There are more landscape professionals that are now stepping up in our area that come forward to do a lot of this. Some of the developers are kind of okay, so in the way back. Slabs. Question is about pollutants and from the runoff seeping in and causing a problem. That's definitely a concern. It's been a concern in our state for quite a while. We've done some other work in a different area. It's also landlocked, and I think unless you have a particular hotspot like a gas station or an industrial user, we were able to show with a groundwater monitoring network and surface water monitoring that all those pollutants are well filtered as they go down through soil profile. When you think about why people like to use wells for drinking water, it's because naturally it's such a great filter system that it tends to take care of most, but not all. A few of the issues become nitrates. If you have a high nitrate setting, typically in urban areas, it's not as big of an issue, maybe in agricultural areas. And chlorides is one that is still kind of watching. Chlorides is the hard one to stress. But otherwise, we have not had many issues with that, as far as contamination of groundwater.
Building on that groundwater question, have you identified whether or not some of the practices you're implementing will help alleviate some of the groundwater depletion issues?
I would say that's in process. I mean, this is the whole idea is to try to mimic the natural recharge here. We're end up doing sort of if you look at the surface water, you're saying, oh, good, we're not pushing all this water downstream. Well, if you change your perspective on the groundwater, what you're doing is keeping that flow system and preserving that going in. I wouldn't say that we're at the point yet where we think that it's sustainable. I think there's almost a bigger issue. We have a lot of potable water withdrawals that get treated, that end up going down to a treatment plant and discharged directly to the river. So this helps preserve the groundwater system, but I mean, I think we're also still we're breaking the hydrologic cycle by taking groundwater and then discharging it to a river. And so now there's a lot of talk about whether we should take river water, treat it, and use that as our source instead of discharging it, or try to recharge that groundwater and use a lot for conservation. But this is certainly helpful.
One more. So I'm curious, how does your system taking groundwater and sending it pretty directly into here, how does that affect, like, say, flood waters? Because here in Ames, this actually particular region has had issues with flooding. The basketball stadium right across had a few issues with water in it a few years ago. So if you were to say appropriate system to our area, how would this affect that?
So the question, as I understand it, is this infiltration of the water, holding it back, how does that play out in a flooding kind of scenario? I think that's a good question. That's conventional wisdom, and I run into a lot of people all over the country that say, well, this pre-infrastructure stuff is nice, it's good for water quality, but it really doesn't matter when it comes to flood control or things like that. But I think this is the perfect example of, we have had 10 inches of rain, nothing flooded, and it didn't go downstream either. So we were able to retain that water. So I think that tendency to want to kind of dismiss it when it comes to flood control, I think is not the right way to go. And obviously you need to do more than maybe a half an inch or an inch of runoff. You need to be willing to take on a fair amount, but if your system can handle that, it really can have a benefit on flooding problems.
Sorry, it's lunchtime. Upstairs, there's 3 tables. Make lines on both sides. You say yes.